My name is Dr. Chrissy Gale, and I've been working in international development for around, I hate to say this, but over 35 years now. And I've had the privilege to live and work all around the world with a specialism in child protection and children who are without parental care, so children in alternative care. And also I've worked for amazing agencies such as Oxfam, UNICEF, Save the Children, the UNHCR and different organizations around the world. And I'm delighted to have been invited by the Danish Child Protection Network to help facilitate 8 seminars, all based around the content of the 2019 UN resolution, the promotion and the protection of the rights of children. I'd like to introduce you to Lasse Hensen. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Lasse is the head of Global Contact in Denmark. Global Contact is part of MS Action Aid Denmark, and it has been sending volunteers out since 1946 to work in different countries of the world. The project started to help rebuilding Europe after World War II, so it's been going on for a very long time now. And since the 1980s, it's been sending volunteers to the Global South. Global Contact facilitates volunteering and study trips for around 1,400 people from Denmark each year. The vision and ethical foundation of the program will be presented by Lasse now, who's been in charge of the program since 2009. So without much ado, I hand you over to Lasse. Thank you very much for joining us, Lasse.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get everything ready here. Okay, I hope you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can, thanks.
That's great.
We can
okay.
see your whole screen, but that's fine also.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so yeah, and if there's any questions, feel free to I guess you're going to use the chat, but I'd like August to help me if there's any questions, because I can't see the chat while I'm also presenting.
Yes, perhaps you could press the little presentation button.
Say again?
Sorry, do you hear us?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's because right now you're sharing the screen with the PowerPoint instead of the presentation. So you need to change the setting for it to share the presentation and not the PowerPoint side, if that makes sense.
Actually, I don't.
It's a little complicated, but so when you share your screen while you're still on the...
Oh, I should share the presentation instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that it? Okay, I'll probably have to go back then.
Yeah, but this happens
just a second.
Often. It's not really that logical.
No, let me see if I can figure it out. Here we go, I think. I hope. Maybe this one. Yes, is this any better?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, just a second. Okay, but now I have to find out. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yes, my name is, like Chrissy said, Lasse Jensen, and I'm head of Global Contact, which is the volunteering team within MS Action Aid Denmark. And you can see, as you can see in the first screen, and also actually just repeating what Chrissy said, that we've been around for a long time. And we're part of MS Denmark, and who mostly work with advocacy and anti-corruption democracy with the human rights-based approach since the 1960s, mostly in the global south, but in the recent years also in Denmark, since we realize that especially racism and discrimination is also a growing problem here in Europe. So we thought it would, after a while, that it was a bit funny that we spent all the time trying to work with this in the global south, while it was actually emerging here in our own backyard as well. The reason why we're named Global Contact and not MS Denmark is actually for that reason as well, that we want MS Denmark wants to separate these two parts, that the Global Contact is a volunteering team and organization within MS Denmark, because we don't want to pretend that volunteering is development work. It's not professionals we're sending out. We're not making development in a classical understanding, but it's more of cultural exchange of the program. We are quite big, at least in Denmark. We're by far the biggest NGO who sends out, who have this exchange, probably even also bigger than the commercial ones, both the international ones, well, in Denmark at least, right? So we send out volunteers, mostly young volunteers who are doing their gap year, send out an increasing number of electives, that means mostly students within the healthcare sector, nurses, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, also social workers, teachers. We do also an increasing number of study trips where we send out schools, not to do volunteering, but actually mostly they can maybe do one day of volunteering, but mostly for like a study trip for what to know about one country's political situation, or the situation on gender, etc. And also we have a lot of summer schools, mostly in the global south. We're having partners and host families in 20 plus countries. As a part of the program, we do our utmost to have people living at host families, because we believe that that's a really good way to actually get to understand the country you're visiting, instead of living in a volunteer house, or even worse, in a gated community where you're not, where you're, what can you say, not really included in the local communities. We do a mandatory 4-week training for all volunteers below 25 years, which is the most of the volunteers. I think it's 90% of the volunteers we're sending, or maybe even 95% of the volunteers. In regards to the volunteering, and yeah, maybe I should just make a small disclaimer first. I'm not an expert within the residential care area, and like Chrissy and so probably some of the others of you, so bear with me if I use any of the wrong wording or terminology within child protection. And I usually this is the Danish wording, and like actually what Chrissy said, that we are so fortunate that the orphanage wording, orphanage, is not really used in Denmark. We talk about places for vulnerable children, so that's the wording I'm going to be using here. But anyways, please bear with me if I use some of the wrong wording. It's not intentionally. So MS Denmark has been on a big long journey in this. I think I can say that maybe I don't know when, but many years ago there was this, that it's better to do nothing than, or better to do something than nothing, which actually I think also was part of the development work in the early stages, that it was at least we did something. And of course that changed over the years as we got more and more knowledge on this, how it actually affects children having grown-ups around them, and especially for vulnerable children. So this last year we made a policy and a guideline for sending out volunteers to work with vulnerable children. Before that, we had a big debate whether we should even stop doing it, but in the end we decided to continue and then make these guidelines to make sure that we don't do any harm. And what I'm gonna do in this presentation, I'm just gonna outline some of the guidelines, and not all. It's a bigger paper, but just some of the very concrete ones, to hopefully to make you get an understanding of our thinking and what we are trying to do, while still sending out volunteers to work with vulnerable children. And here's some of them. The overall approach is that one thing is that we shouldn't normalize access to vulnerable children, and actually that's a very common debate, that where we have the volunteers using vulnerable children as their background and in their life and their exciting life, being in the beach in the morning and patting a poor child on the head in the afternoon. So I mean, to make the volunteers aware that it's I mean, very concrete way of seeing it. I mean, don't take pictures and put them on Instagram and just use them as background paper to your perfect life. Do a background check on volunteers. Train and inform the volunteers. That's been a part of MS Denmark for a long time. It's nothing new. That, like I said in the beginning, 95% of the volunteers, they will be going on mandatory 4-week training in the region where they're going. That means if we send volunteers to Tanzania, they will be starting in 4 weeks in our training center in Kenya. It's not only about, I mean, a lot of the volunteers are not working with vulnerable children, but it's the training is also related to gender, political issues, cultural understanding, conflict management, and etc. But also about this, that we should be more cautious than we were before about institution, when we choose institution or partners, if children are living there permanently. We should generally go for an approach where partners where we can see there's alternative family-based placements instead of institutions. We should also be aware that this is not black and white. It's easy to be black and white when you're here in Denmark, but actually there's a lot of dilemmas. And if those dilemmas, I mean, disciplining children is of course probably the most known one that I mean, a lot of countries you are allowed to do it, but it's actually not the way we see things should do, and in Denmark it's not allowed. So to help the volunteers to find their path in this. Another one, we shouldn't ignore Danish ethical standards just because you're volunteering in another country. That means that if we don't send volunteers to hospitals, because you wouldn't send a volunteer to a Danish hospital. Also, like I said before, we should be aware and sensitive to national regulations and laws. Even though we have our own standards, it also should respect the country we're in and how they might see things differently. And we created a whistleblower line where volunteers can, of course, they've always been it's always been possible for them to get in contact with us if we see and if they see anything that shouldn't be happening. But now we also created a whistleblower line so they can be anonymous. Okay, going into just a few of them of our very concrete guidelines. Maybe I can say that in general, we tried to make these guidelines very concrete because we were really cautious that we didn't end up with a fine theoretical paper, which we will spend a lot of time on, and then will be put in the drawer, and then really not helping to implement this for the volunteers. Because I think we also been very cautious about when we're making guidelines, we should also help the volunteers, not put everything on the volunteers. Say, okay, we have this guidelines. If you see something differently, you should let us know, because that's a bit too easy. They will be often being in a dilemma if we leave everything to them once they're at the placement or the institution. Okay, so what we tried to do is to make some guidelines where we could easily do as a checkup before even finding a partner, and also to have the partners sign themselves that this is a part of the agreement or the MOU we usually do with the partners, and hopefully find a way forward in this to improve this in general. Yeah, one of them, as you can see, is that there should be more permanent staff or family who act as primary caregivers for the children, as it's crucial for the well-being of the children. For the ones of you who are professionals in this issue, of course, it's obvious to you, but it's actually really nice for us as a partner far away. It's a very nice thing to say, okay, this is easy. I mean, it's also a way of excluding the orphanages or the institutions where it's actually turned into a business. that they are making money just to survive, and so they will have as many volunteers as possible and as little staff as possible, because it's a company, it's a commercial thinking instead of a child-based approach. Here's another small or simple guideline, that since we've learned that especially children under the age of 3, I know some psychologists say it's a bit younger and some say it's a bit older, but the under the age of 3, who's more likely to be damaged by not what you call it continuously attachment, or they have a bigger attachment need, that we will not work with the children's homes who have permanently children under the age of 3 living there, because they will be more exposed to possible damage if they have volunteers change, or the permanent caretaker will be a volunteer who will change every 2 or 3 months. Maybe I should add that we don't do the volunteers cannot stay for less than 2 months, and they have to work for a minimum 20-25 hours a week. Another one is because we all know that family-based solutions is well, it's debatable how much better it is, but it is slightly better, at least than the institutions. So we want to make sure that we don't have any people or any children institutionalized, where once they're at the center or the institution, that then it's considered all fine and nothing else has to be done. So we asked them that they should have a strategy, and we also actually asked them to say, okay, one thing is the strategy, but how is your reality as well? Okay. Okay, I thought there was one more, but yes, okay. That was, I think, my 10-15 minutes.
So Sarah is, this is what she's told me. Sarah's 21 years old and she is living in Copenhagen, Denmark normally. She's studying international intercultural social work at University College Copenhagen. And as I said, is currently doing an internship alongside Peter in Kenya. Besides her studies, she's been facilitating work with young people through the Red Cross, and mostly talking about anxiety, loneliness, and other relevant topics in primary schools. She's working closely with the organization, and we've got someone from that organization here today as well, 100% for Children. And she's been working closely with that organization both before she went to do her internship and now while she's doing her internship. And in fact, Camilla, who might wave, was indeed with Sarah and Peter in Kenya the other week. Sarah's also a substitute caregiver at an institution for people with mental illness in Copenhagen. Peter is 23 years old, also lives in Copenhagen, and he's also studying to be a social worker at the University College Copenhagen. His field of study is international and intercultural social work as well. And again, he has this cooperation with 100% for Children through his internship that he's doing through his college. Before he started his social work education, he worked for the business and employees organization Danish Industry, and he helped to facilitate meetings. So I'd like to now turn over to Sarah and Peter, and they're going to tell us a little bit about the internship they're doing and where they are and why they're doing it. Thank you, Sarah and Peter.
Thank you. Okay, I will just try to share. If our connection is a little bad, it's the Kenyan connection. So just say if we fall out a little bit. It can be a little unstable. Yes, so thank you for the introduction, Chrissy. We will just start our presentation with telling a little bit about ourselves. I will start out. My name is Sarah. I study social work because my passion has always been with people. I've always loved to work with people. I think social work is a great education where you can learn about ethics, social problems, law, psychology, all combined. And I think it's a very a powerful combination. Yes, I wanted to study international and intercultural social work because I think now, in these times, the world is getting smaller. All cultures are mixing. We're living with people from other cultures. So I think it's very important to get a cultural understanding from all around the world. And internship in Kenya, I chose mostly because I love to travel. I love to see different parts of the world. And I got we talked about PLK, and PLK sounded really nice and interesting. And through 100% for the Children, we started the cooperation. And yeah, I love NGO work, so that's why I ended up in Kenya. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Peter, as Chrissy have told you, and I'm also studying international and intercultural social work at University College Copenhagen. And I choose this field of study because I think that globalization, migration, and urbanization are really interesting topics. And therefore, it was pretty natural for me also to travel to Kenya to see what opportunities there is down here. And I also think that the NGO work is really interesting. I could see myself work in one of them when I'm finished. Yeah. So I want to just quickly talk about our university. It's called University College Copenhagen, or in Danish, Københavns Professionshøjskole. They offer us 21 different bachelor and academic degrees. And in these bachelor educations, it is mandatory to have an internship. And the planning for this internship starts approximately 1 year before the internship. And in that time you are finding your organization, you are creating the contact, and you are preparing for the trip with some more practical stuff. And that means understanding of the cultural, socio-economically conditions of your host country. University College Copenhagen does not set any criteria about the country, but they set criteria about your organization, your host organization. The student has to fulfill some specific learning targets, and University College Copenhagen has to be able to communicate with them in English. Yes. So we were so lucky to have Positive Life Kenya as our host organization. Positive Life Kenya is a non-governmental organization that is based in Mololongo, Kenya. The organization supports families living in the forgotten slums. A forgotten slum is a slum that is neglected by the government or other NGOs because they rather focus on the bigger slums. Especially in Kenya, it will be Kibera, that is the second biggest slum in the world. Positive Life Kenya also supports the surrounding area of Mololongo, that is Athi River, Busia, Baringo, and Siaya. The main vision of Positive Life Kenya is to see families living with dignity and free of poverty, and that is depicted in their logo, as you see on the right, where you see a family that is held by the hands of PLK, and the children is in the middle, and it represents that the work it works around the children. It's about empowering the children, empowering the new generation to make it sustainable. Positive Life Kenya have some different projects. They have a grandmother project, or in Swahili it's called Shosho, because grandmothers are really vulnerable since they are maybe a little bit weak, and they don't have like a family to support them. They are also having a pilot project with the street children, where they go out in the slums and try to make some sustainable changes for them. That could be education, maybe stop some addiction. They also have a sponsorship program where they find private funders to sponsor their scholarship, if you could say like that, to the school, so the children can get some education. They also have life skill sessions, and a life skill session is a way of is for children to learn about some topics that are relevant in the teenage age and in the children age. It could be sex, puberty, or as Sarah is going to talk about later, menstruation. They also have 2 schools. They have Tumaini, that is placed in Kitchego slum, and they also have Kiutani, that is a boarding school in Machakos County. They have HIV programs for HIV positives. And last, they have this house called Faraja House that has like a workshop, a sewing workshop, and a program for young mothers where they can get training in the sewing workshops. And they have like a safe space to go evolve with their kids and learn how to be a good mother.
And they live in this house.
And they live in this house.
Yeah.
Yes. So all of these programs are pretty much focused on empowering the people that need it.
Mm.
So our role as interns in Positive Life Kenya, we are active in the day-to-day activities, the programs and projects I have just talked about. And then we also do field reports and profiles after these different projects. We also participate in these briefings we keep each week, and we're also helping to find these solutions for the family we are working with. So we pretty much participate in all of PLK's programs.
Yes, so we also wanted to address, because we hear a lot talk about volunteering, internships, and we want to make sure that we understand that it's 2 different things and 2 separate things from each other. It's not the same. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about interns. First of all, interns is of course from the university. So before your internship, we had 3 semesters of education, as 1.5 years of education before going to the internship. There is a collaboration between the university and the organization that includes a contract and just communication all through the internship. We have supervisions weekly with the host organization. We have a supervisor who will talk about challenges. How is the internship going? Is there anything we need to think about or they need to think about? Is just discussing the progress. Our purpose is to develop skill and professionalism through the experience of social work, because we are the future social workers, so we have to get the experience to be able to help the future and do our job the best as possible. So yeah, to learn social work, of course, you have to work with people, because you cannot learn to work with people through a book. You will not be the best social worker when you get out in the other side. And if you don't have your internship and you have to learn it when you're done, then we need to start over and you will start your experience there. So it's super important for us. Volunteerism can be for everyone. Mainly, it can be very many different kind of people. In PLK, we have seen people come with different kind of skills that can actually also help the organization a lot. We see construction workers, we see nurses, teachers, social workers, a lot of different volunteers who maybe a construction worker take 2 weeks out of their schedule to come build a toilet in the slum, or for the Fadacha home, the women's home, the young women's home, maybe build something for them, help them build some tables, something. And there are also volunteers who come here as young people, as we just heard about, who pay for their stay. So yeah, volunteers and interns are 2 very different things and have 2 very different purposes for their stay. To quickly say about the ethics in social work, ethics is a mandatory topic for us throughout education. We learn it from day 1. It's super important to be reflective about every decision that we make and every move that we make as a social worker, especially also with children. So this is what we learn just from the very beginning. We use IFSW, which is International Federation of Social Workers, and the Danish Social Worker Professional Ethics. These are the ones that we mainly work from, and these are kind of like the law in social work. So I just pointed out two of these values. The first one is the social worker is willing to cooperate with the education institutions to give the students the newest knowledge of work and our short training of the best quality. This means that as a as an educated social worker, you are permitted to learn, give knowledge that you have learned throughout your work to the newer students, because the newer students, yeah, they are the leaders of tomorrow, you can say. The next value is the social worker have a special responsibility to ensure the contact between the citizen and the social worker. This means that for me, and also as a student, it's my responsibility to create trust and have a bond with this child and make sure that I create a safe space for them to talk. But at the same time, keep it a professional relation, so that it's not a personal relationship, but a professional relationship. And that responsibility, of course, is with me, it's on my shoulders. Yes. So a little bit about why internships are so important from our perspective. For us, of course, it's creating and shaping new good social workers who are the ones to do this professionally. From an international perspective, it can benefit the local organizations by giving them, for us, a Danish perspective. I will quickly just give an example. Here you can see on the picture, I'm doing what Peter told about life skills. Here I'm showing a loop cup, which is like a menstrual cup we got from 100% for the children. I'm explaining this because the very, very young, like it is children, young women, children, have sex with elder men, especially in Kenya, is a big problem to get pads, to get hygienic pads and sanitary towels. So we brought this from Denmark to show, to see if it will be relevant for them. And it was really great. They loved it. It lasts a lot of years. It's recyclable, it's reusable, it's discreet. It's very, very good for them. So when we saw that this was actually need, Camilla, when she was in Kenya, brought, I think it was 100 of them, and we gave them to these girls. It's from Angasa Girls High School. And this is maybe just an example about how it could be beneficial to give a Danish perspective to these local organizations, because they would not be able to get these if it was not because Camilla, who's a Danish organization, brought them. Yes.
So yeah, our experience as international interns. Our length of our internship is 5 months, and we have 2 months left, right? A little bit more than 2 months, and it has been a really learningful experience. You learn how to integrate with a new culture, see how different countries use different methods into social work, and you can kind of benefit from that. It's like a learning by doing process, where you give and take a little bit. We can give some feedback and we can get some knowledge from them. We have also learned how to do home visits and have conversation with a translator, because in Kenya, the main language is Swahili, and it had taken quite a time to adapt to, and we still do. So sometimes we need to have a translator, and that skill we can probably also going to use when we come back home in Denmark, or are going to be social workers in Denmark. We also learn to facilitate meetings and life skills, as Sarah was talking about, with these different topics. Sorry. And we also got experience from home visits and community work in these vulnerable areas, where we have gone home and make journaling. That is also a big part of the Danish social work. And of course, we have seen the NGO work in general, of how it works, how it's structured, and how they are funding money for these different projects.
Yes. So lastly, we know we may be taking a little too much time, but lastly, we wanted to say from our perspective how the recruitment of interns and volunteers can improve. This is our perspective. We've talked to some of the volunteers we've worked with in the organization, and some of the staff members too. First of all, it's very important to advocate the organization to give clear and relevant guidelines and boundaries to protect the target group, because the local organizations are the ones who know their target group the best. They know where is the vulnerability, where do we need to protect these children and people in general. So it's very important that they put on clear and relevant guidelines, so that we protect this group the best. The next one is to have a relevant motivation and purpose for going. This is more towards the volunteers. to have maybe an interview before coming, or an interview or something, so that we know, okay, what is your motivation? Maybe it's a construction worker that would be relevant, but what is your motivation and what is your purpose? What do you want to get out of this, and what can we get out of this? So very important to make this discussion before. Then we say focus on long-term volunteer and internship programs. Of course, internships is a bit longer, just because it has a mandatory length. But volunteers, we have seen that the long-term volunteers has been able to do some changes here, but also has been the one who made the most sense. The short-term volunteers, they don't get to do as much because they're here for, of course, short period of time. Of course, again, this is towards the one who work with the children, the ones who build stuff and that kind of work. That depends on their work. But if you are working with children, do it long term, of course. And then we talked about the possibility of background checks for interns specifically. We talked to our school about this background checks, and for the school, our university, in the Danish law, it will not be allowed for them to do background checks. It's in the Danish law that it's the personal information they can't ask for that. We would advise maybe that the organization would demand the background checks, and they would say, if you have to have an internship here with our children, we need a police report from you. That would be a possibility, but it cannot come from the school. The school cannot ask for that. So yeah, I think that was it.
I had the great privilege of meeting Sinet for the first time in the last few weeks. And Sinet is a care leaver activist. She is care experienced herself. She is the director on the board of an organization called the Cambodian Children's Trust. So she is going to speak to us from Cambodia today, where she's working to build a national support network for care leavers. She's also a scriptwriter, and if you look her up, you'll see some of the awards she's won for some of her audio and video work. Her story has gained international media attention, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her experience living in care today, which also led to an invitation for her to testify at the Australian Parliamentary Inquiry into Modern Slavery in 2017. She has many accolades in her name and many achievements and experiences. So I've only picked out a few, but in 2021, she was selected as one of the 16 young leaders from around the world to serve as a member of the USAID Center on Children in Adversity Council. And I know that she's spoken on many platforms about issues related to children in alternative care and about volunteerism. And I know that she does an awful lot of work to continue to advocate for change for children in care. Sinet, I know this is going to be a very powerful presentation, and I know your words are going to speak for themselves. So I'm just going to hand over the floor to you, and welcome and thank you for being with us today. We're really, really pleased to have you. Sinet.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chrissy. So I'm so happy to join the meeting today and hearing the guest speaker experience. So before I end up living in the orphanage, my life was normal. I lived with my father, my mother, and 6 siblings, and I am the number 4. So, but when we was young, I enjoyed like engage with my friend, and like being like a normal kids. And go out into the village. When it rains, I go to the rice field to, pick up wild morning glory, catching frog, crab for my family. And I enjoy it because this is how I grow up. Unfortunately, I grew up with like a poor family, but for me, even we are poor, but I feel all the love, all the care, all the warmth from my parents, from my brother and sister, and also my friend and my neighbor. So for me, surrounding where I live, I feel belonging. I feel this is it. This is my life where I grow up. I enjoy living where I'm living right now. Later on, when I was about 9 years old, my father died from HIV, and like a few months later, my mother fell sick because of AIDS. But back then we didn't know. I didn't know that my parents died from HIV. Only when I grow older, I know that is HIV. And because our financial, like my father is the one who is responsible for the financial, and then when he died, the whole family fell down. My mother is sick, so no one can go out to work and to support us, to put the food on the table for us. And later, I remember that day until now, that there was a director of the orphanage come to visit our house, talking to my mother, saying that if my mother agree to take me to live in the orphanage, he promised my mother that I will have education, enough food to eat, and have a bright future. And my mother have no choice. She's a single mom and sick. No one support us. So she agreed for all of us to go to live in an orphanage. And when back then I thought the same thing. I thought, this is it. I can continue my education, and at the same time, I'm looking for my brighter future, and expect that when I go to the orphanage, I will have enough food to eat. And when I arrive at the orphanage, my expectation is changing. It is not the same what I expect, or like in my imagination, it's not like that. I feel very scared, very unsafe. In the orphanage, there is a lot of kids, like 80 kids. And there is only 2 nannies to look after those children. And girls and boys, adult and young are living together. It's mixed, and it's very like miserable, messy, and very crowding, and like disaster for me. And we were forced to work from morning until evening at the director rice field. Back then, I thought that the way that they asked us to work just to, like to generate all the profit to support the orphanage. But later I know that it's the form of exploitation, like taking all my energy to do that work and to generate fund for the director of the orphanage. And we don't have enough food to eat. We get like punishment, like get hit all the time. And if we don't go to work, it will be like whipping until you get bleed. And I was raped for so many years. And the director of the orphanage, he threatened to kill me if I tell anyone. And I live in fear, but not just for me. The rest of the kids, they are living in fear. And I lived there for such a long time, from 80 kids until 20 kids, because some of them is running away from the orphanage. And if those kids, if the director caught those kids back, like huge punishment, the director of the orphanage will staff them or make them to work on the rice field. So my routine from morning until the evening is working like 4 o'clock in the morning and to work in the rice field, like water, vegetable, working through season, and on the cow farm and the fish farm, and all profit never go to us. We never eat that fish, never eat that vegetable. All is going to the market. And because today's session is all about the volunteer, during my time working on the land of the director, at the same time, I need to entertain the volunteer or donor or supporter who come to the orphanage. It's like working for us, like 2 jobs at the same time. Like your holiday, it's my work, my full-time work. Back then, I don't find it's work. I find it's the most happy time, because that is the only time that we have enough food to eat. We have gift, we have like joys, dancing, like happy to sing you a song, playing game with them, like, make a bracelet for you, pick up the wildflower for you, do anything to entertain you so that you can donate to us, to give us enough food to eat. And there is like a full-time schedule. It's a season, and follow to there is many nationality, like French, Australia, Chinese, Japanese, Korea, and many white people, mostly white people, come to an orphanage. And my schedule is very busy. I don't have time to study. It's to entertain all the volunteer, donor, and supporter. And when you guys come, it's like 1 day, 2 days, sometime an hour, sometime like longer, sometime, like years. During that time, I was so happy. I think everyone is happy. My friend is happy. But when it's time to say goodbye, like our heart is breaking. We feel the abandonment. To our perspective, you guys are our friends. Someone who is like our family, who is support us, taking care of us, even like a few hours, but for us, it's like attachment. And we was crying just to say goodbye. And you guys promised, like, I will come back, I will write you a letter. But that promise never exists, never happened. And every year, every month, I met different people, new people, different faces. And every time I hear the sound of the bus, I will run to the gate just to see is my friends come. But actually it's not. And for the supporter, like donor, like sponsor a kid, like some volunteer come or donor come, you see like us, like, oh, those kids, it's very beautiful, I want to sponsor you. Like you think that you supporting us, sponsor us, like for example, I don't know back then how much I will get for like to sponsor me, I don't know. But I was forced to write you guys a letter saying that I am well, I have enough food to eat, asking about your daily life, like how is the weather, how is your family. While we wrote that letter, it's checked by the director of the orphanage. We can't tell you that we staff, they hit us, they force us to go to work. We can't do it. And later on, that is those experience I have with the volunteer and the like sponsorship, like donors, supporter. And later on, I was rescued by an organization called the Cambodia Children Trust. And I moved from the most abusive, corrupt orphanage to live at the best orphanage that I never imagined. During that time, I received like, you know, have enough food to eat, education, healthcare, clean water to drink. I don't need to go to work, only focus with study. The best thing. But during those times, I asked myself, why I am not happy? Why I can't engage with people? Why I can't talk to people? Why can't I be like a normal people? Until a few years later, I moved to live independent in Phnom Penh. And that year, I know why I can't live with the society, live with the real society, because I was struggled when I was at the orphanage. I have the attachment disorder. I can't make friends. I can't talk to people. I got shaken talking to you guys. I got nervous, panic attack. Like I throw up talking to people. Because I experienced the abandonment when I was at the orphanage. I lose trust. I don't want to talk with like the volunteer come to the orphanage because it's hurting my feeling. And believe me, this is not my only experience. It's go to, for example, right now I'm running a caregiver network. I interview 10 caregiver, 9 out of 10, they experience the same thing what I am experiencing. It's a long-term effect for those kids. I am 31 this year, and I'm still healing myself just to be normal like other people. And to me, when I hear somebody volunteer at the orphanage, or I think they want to do a good thing, but actually you are not doing good thing. You're hurting us. And there is many things to support, like to be a better volunteer, to be a better intern. And I mean, there will be a long discussion if, you know, to be a safe volunteer or to be, you know, intern. So I think Martin and Rebecca will, you know, guide you with that. And this is my story. So I hope I can share you guys something to learn from. And thank you for having me today. Yeah. Sorry for taking such a long time.
No, Sinet, I want to thank you so much indeed for being with us today, for talking about your personal experience. We're very, 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 it's very important for us to hear this. And we all, you know, as you and I know, there is nothing more powerful than hearing it. We can all talk about, you know, our research and our understanding, and we will hear some very important findings from Martin and Rebecca, but there is nothing more powerful than hearing it from someone such as yourself. And I want to thank you so much for standing on platforms like this and for advocating for children and young people all around the world who have gone through the same experience. And as you said, unfortunately, we do know that this is happening to thousands of children all around the world every day. And your experience and the way that you are able to bring this experience to us will mean we really do get a much better and deeper understanding. And so I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for talking to us this way today, and for all the work you're doing around the world to advocate for change. I thank you so much for that. On to Martin. I'm going to introduce you to Martin Punkas. And Martin is going to talk a little bit to some of the issues that Sinet has very, very kindly shared with us today. Martin has over 20 years experience working in child protection, of which the last 10 years he's specialised in children without parental care and reform. Martin has lived and worked in India and Nepal for 7 years, and he's worked a lot with grassroots NGOs and social movements that promote family-based care. And I know that also Martin and Rebecca have worked on prevention of family separation. And I think that also addresses one of the really important issues that Sinet raised as to one of the really important principles in the UN guidelines for the alternative care of children, which is we should prevent unnecessary separation of families. And both in the UN guidelines and in the in the 2019 UN resolution, it very clearly states that poverty alone should never be a reason that children are prevented from remaining with their family. And that's something that we really all have to work very, very hard to address. So sorry, I just needed to say, put that in there. Martin is head of global training and advocacy, became a head of global training and advocacy services for J.K. Rowling's Lumos Foundation, where his team provided technical support to over 70 countries. He's also recently been working for UNICEF in Kenya to support the Kenyan government in developing national care reform strategies. And also he works with Family for Every Child. Over the last 10 years, Martin's work has included a strong focus on tackling particularly orphanage volunteering and trafficking. And I think this is a really important word that Martin will probably explain more about. And I know those of you who've joined us from Nepal, something that struck me when I was doing an assessment of the child protection system in Nepal a few years ago was the very powerful word of the use of the word trafficking in Nepal's reports of children being sent into orphanages and institutions. And Martin has an MA with a distinction in anthropology of development from SOAS, and he's also, importantly, a husband, a father, and he advocates for families everywhere. So we'd like to open the floor to you, Martin, and we're going to be very interested in hearing what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. I'm just going to share my screen. So yeah, thanks very much, Chrissy, for that introduction, and thank you very much to SOS Denmark and the Danish Child Protection Network for letting me come today to speak to you all. As Chrissy said, I've worked in child protection for about 20 years. In the last 10 years, I've been specialising in care reform and the issue of orphanage volunteerism and volunteerism. I lived and worked in Nepal and India for about 8 years. Working around these issues, and I'll probably share a few stories from my time, particularly working in Nepal. I'd like to start off though by just saying a big thank you to Sinette actually for sharing her incredibly powerful story. I've been fortunate enough to have heard Sinette's story a few times before at events I've attended, and I have to say that every time I hear it, it still hits me. And it's very, very powerful, very upsetting story, and it really reminds me about how important this issue is, and makes me very grateful that we have opportunities like this to talk about it. So thank you very much, Sinette, for sharing your story again today. So let me also start off by saying that I'm someone who's very pro-volunteering. I'm a big advocate of volunteering when it's done well. During my life, I've been involved in volunteering in a number of different ways. In the UK, when I was younger, for a number of years, I was a volunteer at a youth and community centre in East London. In more recent times, I've been a volunteer for my local COVID-19 mutual aid group, helping vulnerable people in my local area who've been self-isolating or been scared to go out of the house, making sure they can get food and medical supplies and so on. I volunteered internationally with WaterAid in Pakistan. I was a volunteer teacher in a Tibetan refugee school when I was younger as well. And I feel that these opportunities I was given have helped form bonds with local communities. I've learned a lot. I like to think I've helped communities as well through the work, and it's certainly helped me a lot. I've learned a lot. A bit like Sarah and Peter were saying earlier, they're talking about how much they've learned from the work they're doing. I empathize with that. It's the same for me. I've learned a lot from that. And I'm proud of the volunteering I did. However, there's one piece of volunteering I did when I was younger, when I was 19, which I'm not proud of. And that was that I volunteered in an orphanage in Peru for a month. It was an orphanage which worked with severely disabled children. And I went over there, I spoke very little Spanish. I knew nothing about working with children with severe disabilities. Whilst I was there, we really didn't have much to do. We painted some walls. We tried to teach the children English. I'm not sure how useful that would be for their situation, but we didn't have much else to do. We took them on a few day trips out. I'm very ashamed to say that where we slept was we actually slept in the same room as the children, and some of the children were actually taken out of their bedrooms and asked to sleep in the corridor so that we could sleep in their rooms. We were seen to be more important than them. I look back and I shudder, to be honest, at what I did. At the time, I thought I was doing something really good. I thought I was doing something to help the severely disabled children. Now I know better, and I know that it really wasn't helping at all. It was actually harming. And I'll tell you more about why I've changed my view on this quite considerably since I was 19. I think underlining all this is that one of the central principles of international development is that we should do no harm. If we are going to do anything we do in international development, that everyone agrees that it cannot harm local communities. And in my view, orphanage volunteering or volunteering in residential care centres for children does do harm, even though, as Sinette said, that people's intentions are good, their motivations are good. Actually, it does cause harm. And I'm going to hopefully take some of what Sinette has been talking about and try and put that into a sort of broader context and explain why orphanage volunteering is harmful. Now, Chrissy mentioned a moment ago about the UN General Assembly 2019 resolution on the rights of the child, very important UN resolution, which I think these series of seminars have been organised around. And there's one particular clause in the UN resolution which I really want to draw your attention to. It's clause 35, which is very much about urging states to take action to ensure the enjoyment of human rights for all children without parental care. The focus is very much on states taking responsibility to protect the rights of children. And there's a particular subclause which is relevant to this whole discussion, and I'll read it out to you. It's about taking appropriate measures to protect children who are victims of trafficking and are deprived of parental care, as well as enacting and enforcing legislation to prevent and combat the trafficking in and exploitation of children in care facilities, and supporting children who are victims of trafficking and returning to their families and receiving mental health and psychological assistance that is victim-centered and trauma-informed, and taking appropriate measures to prevent and address the harms related to volunteering programs in orphanages, including in the context of tourism, which can lead to trafficking and exploitation. Now, if I was completely new to this subject and I read this or someone told me about this, I'd be thinking, what? Like, what's the connection between being a volunteer, which is a good thing, and children in orphanages being trafficked? How do the two things connect? They seem like completely separate things. How can being a volunteer working with children be connected somehow with trafficking and exploitation? I wouldn't see the connection at all. And the piece about in the context of tourism, well, what's the difference? What's the connection with tourism and orphanages? I wouldn't understand that either. Told me this when I was 19, when I was volunteering in an orphanage. I'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm doing great work. I'm volunteering with children. My motivations are good. So I'm going to try and break this down a little bit and show you what the links are. And I'm going to do that by telling you a story. And this is a story which I was involved with during my time working in Nepal. So it's about two international volunteers, Jessica and Nicole. Jessica and Nicole were from Australia, and they were both doing round the world trips. And as part of their round the world trips, they both ended up in Nepal, and they felt like, as well as experiencing the wonders of the world, they wanted to give something back. They wanted to do something helpful for a country like Nepal. So they signed up with a volunteering agency in Kathmandu, and they found themselves at an orphanage called Mukti Orphanage in Kathmandu, which ironically means freedom in Nepali. My Nepali colleagues here today will know that. And Jessica and Nicole, they volunteered in Mukti Orphanage for about 3 months. And during that time, they took the kids to school, they played with the kids, they helped out in the orphanage, helped them with their homework and so on. They did a lot of good work. And they were so inspired by, this is in this picture here, the lady with the blonde hair is Jessica. And the lady in the blue dress is a lady called Goma Luatel, and she was the orphanage owner. She ran the orphanage. And Jessica and Nicole talked about in a blog that Nicole wrote. And the reason we know this story is because Nicole's blog is available online. She shared her story publicly. They talk about how inspired they were by Goma Luatel. She was a wonderful woman, a social worker who dedicated her life to providing an orphanage and care for children who'd been orphaned as a result of Nepal's civil war. All these children didn't have parents, and they were so inspired that they helped Goma raise money for the orphanage. They wrote letters to ex-volunteers asking for donations. They helped Goma process some inter-country adoptions, so some of these children could have better lives in other countries, in Western countries and so on. And after 3 months, Jessica and Nicole left the orphanage. They carried on with their travels. I suspect they're probably back in Australia now. And to this day, I suspect that Jessica and Nicole have no idea what was really happening in Mukti Orphanage. Even though they were there for 3 months, I suspect they had no idea the truth behind what was going on there. Let's fast forward to 4 years later, to 2010. Goma Luatel had become a very wealthy woman. She was reported to have built a big house on the grounds of the orphanage. She was wearing nice clothes, nice jewelry. She'd become very wealthy. But the truth was that Goma Luatel was not the kind, caring social worker she portrayed herself as. The truth was, behind the scenes, she was beating the children, she was hitting the children, she was calling them names, and she was also threatening the children, saying, don't tell the volunteers the truth. The truth was that all these children had families, similar to what Sanette was talking about. She had a family already. These children came from families. Many of them had parents that were alive, but they had been separated from their families and brought to this orphanage so they could be used to raise money from people like Jessica and Nicole and other volunteers. Now, in 2010, Goma Luatel went too far. A girl was walking home from school and was hit by a car, and the children got her back to the orphanage. Goma Luatel was angered by this, so she sent the child up to the roof of the orphanage. In Nepal, people have flat roofs, and the girl had to stay on the roof, and she was told, you stay there until you get better. Obviously, she didn't get better. She'd been in a car accident. Eventually, Goma Luatel got so angry, she sent the other children up to the roof and told them they had to beat the girl with nettles and iron rods, which obviously made things much, much worse. Finally, actually, a relative of Goma's came to the orphanage. They saw what was happening and they rescued the girl. They got her to a hospital, but sadly, the girl died of her injuries. The police investigated, and Goma Luatel was able to persuade the police that the girl had died of natural causes. Goma Luatel was quite well connected politically, and she had influence in this respect, and it's of no surprise that she was able to persuade the police to drop the investigation. There are stories of some of the parents of the children having come to the orphanage to try and get their children out, and Goma would threaten them and send them away and say, I've got friends in high places. I know the politicians. You go away. You've got no right to your children. They're my children now. There was even a story of one mother who was so desperate to see her child that she went in disguise and got a job as a cleaner simply so she could have access to her child without Goma Luatel finding out that she was really their parents. So you can imagine for the children in the orphanage, this was a terrible place to be. They were not allowed to tell the truth to the volunteers. They'd been involved in the death of one of their friends. It was all pretty awful. Finally, a volunteer actually from Germany came back to the orphanage to visit, and the children trusted her and they couldn't hold back any longer. So they told this volunteer what had happened, and the volunteer was very responsible. She went to UNICEF, she went to an NGO called Terre des Hommes, reported it. Terre des Hommes took the issue up, took it forward with the government. A rescue was carried out, and the organisation I worked for, Next Generation Nepal, carried out that rescue with the government, and we managed to get all 20 children out of the orphanage. It turned out that all these children had living families, and we were able to get 18 of these children back to their family members, living back with their families who all loved them, had all missed them dearly. They needed some support to care for them. They needed some help to be able to take care of the children. But to my knowledge, all these children have grown up happily in their families. There was never a reason they needed to be separated. There were 2 children we couldn't get back to their families, and that's because Goma Luatel had taken them when they were very young, and she'd falsified all the records to turn them into paper orphans. So despite our best efforts, we weren't able to find those children's families. I don't doubt their families are out there somewhere, but Goma had destroyed all records of us being able to find that. Now, the point of this story is that Jessica and Nicole were good people. They thought they were doing something good, and there were many volunteers like Jessica and Nicole. They were there for 3 months living in the orphanage, and they never suspected any of this. This was all hidden from them. But the only reason that Goma Luatel had these children in this orphanage, the only reason they've been separated, trafficked to the orphanage, was so that Goma Luatel could use them as poverty commodities. She could effectively sell them to volunteers and to foreign donors, so that she could raise money for the orphanage. She had one donor, in fact, that was giving her all the money to the orphanage she needed, but she was still raising more money and keeping it as profit. Now, it's very easy to volunteer in an orphanage, especially in countries like Nepal, Cambodia, Kenya, Uganda, and so on. If you do a Google search, volunteer Nepal, this is what comes up. You'll be, even if you haven't thought of volunteering in an orphanage, you will be given lots of opportunities to volunteer in an orphanage in Kathmandu. If you just turn up in Nepal as a backpacker, you go in the tourist district of Tamil, there's lots of notices like this one. Urgent notice for foreigner, needed volunteer in orphanage home. I happen to know for a fact that this orphanage home that claims that the children are all orphans, the children are not orphans. We know they have families. And you'll see lots of adverts like this around Kathmandu, and lots of organisations trying to promote volunteers to come to their orphanages, children's homes, shelters, whatever they want to call it. So what we're dealing with here is effectively a business. It's what's known as the orphanage business. It's a very lucrative business. You will get traffickers that will persuade families like Sinette's, that it is in their interest to let their children go, to often pay the traffickers some money in Nepal, sometimes up to $500, $600 for their child to get a good education in Kathmandu in a good children's home or boarding school where they'll be looked after and cared for, get a good education. And the idea is many years later, they'll come back educated, wealthy, and they'll care for the family. This is what the families are told. So the traffickers can make good money from the families. Then there's a second way they can make money, which is our good people like Jessica and Nicole, good caring people that really want to do something good. Their motivations are good. They're prepared to pay money to volunteer in orphanages, thinking that they're helping, or give donations to orphanages. And often they go home and they give money, and they go home back to their churches, and their churches give money, or they set up a charity and that gives money. So if you're running an orphanage in a country like Nepal or a children's home, you can make a lot of money, basically, out of children who've been separated from their families for the sole purpose of helping you make money. It's not in the children's best interests, it's in the orphanage's best interests. Now, the story I told you about Mukti Orphanage and Goma Hotel, and the story you've heard from Sinette is, unfortunately, they're not uncommon. This happens a lot. But they are the worst end of the scale. There are many more situations where you have good people running orphanages that have the best intentions and are genuinely trying to help children from poor families. They're trying to do the best for those children. But unfortunately, it's still harmful. It's still harmful if you're running an orphanage and you've got volunteers coming to your orphanage or your children's home, your residential care facility. And I want to explain to you the many reasons why orphanage volunteering is harmful. First of all, many of the volunteers that come lack the appropriate skills to care for those children. I mean, myself, I'm a classic example. I barely spoke Spanish. I knew nothing about working with children with severe disabilities, but I volunteered for a month in an orphanage, and there were many cases like that. We wouldn't let this happen in the UK. I know you wouldn't let it happen in Denmark. You wouldn't allow unskilled, unsupervised volunteers to go and work with severely traumatized children who've been trafficked. It would never be allowed. So why is it allowed in countries like Nepal and Cambodia and Kenya and Haiti and so on? By having foreign volunteers come out and work in residential care facilities, it denies culturally appropriate care and employment for local people. There are lots of people in Nepal who are far better carers than the international volunteers that go over. They can speak the language for a start. They have skills that they understand the culture, they understand what children need. When you have foreign volunteers that go over and teach people about British culture or American culture or Danish culture, speak to their own languages, yes, there's an opportunity for cultural interaction, but when all you're being cared for is by hundreds, thousands of volunteers throughout your life, you're not growing up. You might be living in Cambodia, but you're not growing up in a proper Cambodian context. You're not learning about the culture of Cambodia. And I know many care leavers who say this is really distorted that made life harder for them later. They might know all about Manchester United and love Manchester United, but they've lost the opportunity to learn how to plant rice or to care for the buffalo in their village and so on. Now, I think many of us know that institutional care is harmful for children because it creates attachment disorders when you're separated from your family and you're cared for by many, many different carers. You don't have a chance to form a strong bond with the primary carer, and that affects you, your brain. There's evidence it actually physically affects the brain. It affects your emotional, psychological, physical development. You're much more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, suicide, and so on. Lower educational achievements, people find it harder to integrate into society. Sinette talked about that very articulately, how hard she finds it sometimes to integrate into so-called normal Cambodian society. And certainly when volunteers go to children's homes and orphanages, you're exacerbating that problem because you have a rotating roster of volunteers. Now, sometimes volunteers go for 6 months, sometimes a week, sometimes hours. Literally, in Cambodia, there are places where volunteers literally arrive on a boat, they visit an orphanage, they play for a few hours and they leave, and the next boatload comes in. Now, can you imagine what it's like for a child growing up in that situation? It's like being in a zoo. There are rounds and rounds and rounds of volunteers. And even when a volunteer is going for 6 months, during your childhood, you're still talking about many, many volunteers, you know, up to 100 different volunteers coming in and caring for you, rather than 2 parents or 1 parent, 1 primary carer. It's very, very harmful. And there's 80 years of evidence. John Bowlby, many other people, psychoanalysts, that have proven that this is harmful for children. Now, the vast majority of volunteers that go to volunteer in orphanages are not child abusers, they're not paedophiles, they're good people. Unfortunately, there are some people that are not, that go there intentionally with the purpose of abusing children. And unfortunately, by contributing to this industry, you are contributing to leaving the door open to those people going in and abusing children. Many places where people volunteer with children in other countries, there are no child protection checks undertaken. And Sarah and Peter talked about that earlier, that even in Denmark, there's legal rules which make that difficult. It's very common there aren't child protection checks, and unfortunately there are a minority of people that go there deliberately to abuse children. I saw it many times in Nepal, I'm sad to say. Saw people that went to Nepal deliberately because they knew it was an easy target. Very, very easy to abuse children. You could arrive on a flight, within hours you could be abusing a child from an orphanage. It was that easy, sad to say. And ultimately, even if the orphanage is a good orphanage or a good children's home and it's caring for the children, it's meeting all the standards and there's child protection checks, by volunteering in a children's home, you're contributing to an outdated model of care, which I know this whole series of seminars by SOS and the Danish Child Protection Network have been talking about, that institutional care is an outdated model. There's 80 years of evidence that it doesn't work. It harms children. It's the guidelines to alternative care of children talk about it as being a last case scenario. It's a temporary solution. It's a last case solution. It's not something we want children to go into. Children need to grow up in family and community-based care. This is where they thrive best. It's in their best interests. So by volunteering in an orphanage, instead of volunteering in a project which keeps children with families, you're supporting this outdated model of care. You're perpetuating it. As we know, in some cases, volunteering in orphanages incentivizes trafficking and the unnecessary displacement of children from families. The only reason that those children in Mukti orphanage had been separated, the only reason they'd been trafficked, was because there were nice people like Jessica and Nicole that wanted to help them. If the Jessica and Nicoles didn't go, if they'd understood the situation, they wouldn't end up in those institutions in the first place. And there were orphanage volunteering is linked to broader criticisms of the volunteerism industry generally, which in recent years has come under a lot of criticism. It's this idea that people come from particularly relatively wealthy countries with the assumption that they can all, just simply from the fact they're from a wealthy country, they can help people in a so-called poor country or lesser developed country. But often these people don't have skills, and there are very, very skilled people in their own countries. Like, there are incredibly talented people I know in Nepal, incredibly talented people, and they can't solve the problems in Nepal overnight. These are complex problems that require complex solutions. So the idea that you could have a 19-year-old like I was flying over to Peru and saying, "Hey Peru, I'm going to come and help you. I don't speak your language, I know nothing about your country, but I'm here to help." You know, it's associated with what's known as white savior syndrome and so on. And actually, if we look at the situation in Europe today or America, we have lots of problems in our own society. I mean, I live in the UK, the 5th biggest economy in the world, and we have thousands of people now living out of food banks, literally having to go and get food to survive. You know, it's shocking. And yet I increasingly think as I get older that I should be helping solving the problems in my own society before I fly over to Cambodia or Nepal or India and tell people how to solve the problems there. So these are the point I want to make is that you may be thinking, well, you've given me a shocking story of trafficking in an orphanage. The Net's told us a shocking story, but the orphanage I work with or I support is not like that. It's much better, and that may well be the case, and I'm really happy if that's the case. But if any of these issues still affect the volunteers that are coming to your institution, then I'm afraid it's still a problem. It's still an issue that we have to try and work with. And I'm very conscious, I'm talking about white savior syndrome, that I'm a white middle-aged man sort of telling you what I think you should believe and what you should do. So I'm really glad that Sanette has shared her experience. So it's not just people like me talking about it. I also want to share a short quote from someone I work with very closely in Nepal, a chap called Karjit, who was, he grew up in a series of different orphanages and children's homes in Nepal. He was fortunate that he didn't have the same kind of experience Sanette had. He was generally treated well. They were generally materially treated well. He had a much better material existence than he would have had he grown up in his village. But this is his reflection. This is his very honest reflection, having left care when he shared this with me when he was about 19, I think. He said, there were so many volunteers, short time, long time, middle time, according to their visa. Sometimes they organize a program and I don't want to go. Children sometimes feel angry because they want to do what they want. There was a nice movie and the children they want to watch, but the volunteers organize a football program and house managers say you have to go. And all the children were angry. Why foreigners come to Nepal? Why do they go in orphanages? That time they come for a short time and they give lots of love to us, but then they leave, and when I write, they don't reply. I say to a volunteer, sister, I am very lonely. And they say, no problem, I'm here. But then they go to their country and I write, but they don't reply. When I was little, everyone can love me. Now I'm big and I need love. And I think that resonates for me with many similar things that Sanette talked about earlier. This is the long-term effect of having been brought up in orphanages and children's homes and being cared for by kind, caring volunteers. This is ultimately what you're left with. Karjit doesn't have a good relationship with his parents. They exist, but he feels he barely knows them. He doesn't really know his own culture or the region of Nepal he comes from. He knows a lot about Manchester United. He speaks very good English. He can talk to you about Western Hollywood stars. He's great in terms of understanding my culture, but he really struggles in his own country. And this is the legacy of being growing up in an orphanage and growing up through kind and caring orphanage volunteers. So let me tell you a little bit about the scope and scale of orphanage volunteering. So orphanage volunteerism takes many forms, as a number of people have alluded to already. We're not just talking about orphanages. There are many different terms used for institutional care or residential care, orphanages, children's homes, children's villages, shelters, boarding schools, and so on. But essentially, it's the same issue. Orphanage volunteerism or children's home volunteerism takes many forms. Some of it's associated with the tourism industry and volunteering specifically. So there are many organizations you can go to and you say, I want to be a volunteer in an orphanage, or I simply want to visit an orphanage as part of my travel experience to Kenya or Haiti. And there will be agencies that will take you to the orphanage so you can spend a day there playing with the kids and then you can leave and you pay some money towards it, or you go on a longer term 3-month stint like Jessica and Nicole did, or like I did in Peru. In the faith sector, often these trips are referred to as short-term missions trips. Again, very good, kind Christian people that want to go and help people who are less advantaged than they are. They're inspired by their faith. But again, it's the same issue. It's short-term mission work in an orphanage. We see similar things in Islam as well, similar sorts of issues, and other faiths as well. Education school trips. So we've had some examples already of like study visits, internships, and so on, development education. So you see a lot of schools and universities will organize trips to orphanages and trips to institutions. Same problem. And charities more generally. A number of charities will support orphanages and send over volunteers or give money to orphanages. So orphanage volunteerism comes in many different forms. It's in many different sectors. It's not just a tourist issue. In terms of destination countries, this problem exists in many, many countries. Just off the top of my head, I can think of Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, India, Nepal, Kenya, Uganda, probably Rwanda, Haiti, Guatemala. There are many, many countries around the world where we know we've got good evidence of this problem happening. In terms of the sending countries, Most of our research and most of our evidence comes from so-called Western countries, European countries, Australia, New Zealand, North America, but we're also seeing a rise in orphanage volunteers from the newly wealthy East Asian countries, so Singapore, Hong Kong, China. We're seeing many more Asian tourists visiting orphanages and children's homes now. But also, I'd like to say this is often an internal problem in countries too. So I've been doing a lot of work in Kenya over the last couple of years, and during COVID, when travel shut down, a lot of Kenyan volunteers continued to go. So we're talking about wealthy middle-class Kenyans from Nairobi would still be going out to visit orphanages, giving money to orphanages, doing exactly the same thing. And I've heard them say, "Oh, but it's different. It's not white savior syndrome. I'm Kenyan. You know, these are my brothers and sisters." But actually, the same problem is occurring. The same issues happening. They're still a volunteer. They're still coming and going. They're still creating attachment problems. Still trafficking. Yeah. Just to give you a sense of the size of this industry, well, the volunteerism industry is estimated to be worth between 1.6 to 2.6 billion US dollars per year. And this was a figure from back in 2008. I think since then it's grown massively, so it's probably much bigger. Obviously, COVID has slowed that down a lot, but it's a massive industry. It's a huge money-making industry we're talking about here, the volunteerism industry. Many people are making money out of this, not just the orphanages. Many people in the tourism industry are making money from it. In Uganda, revenue from orphanage tourism is estimated to be 250 million per year. So that's just one country, 250 million a year. It's been estimated that 4 million people in the US have volunteered in overseas orphanages. That's a lot of people. That's just the US. 57.5% of Australian universities and 26.4% of UK universities have promoted orphanage volunteering. It's still considered acceptable amongst many universities, colleges, and so on. People don't see the problems associated with it. COVID-19, just a few words about what happened and how this has affected this whole issue. Well, in 2020, we all know we saw the travel industry effectively be almost completely shut down. It was very difficult to travel to other countries. So orphanage tourism, orphanage volunteering was massively reduced. It was very hard for these placements to be arranged. And in the destination countries, many of these orphanages, there were lockdowns, there were strong gatekeeping mechanisms which prevented people coming in and out of the orphanages. So effectively, the volunteerism industry, the orphanage volunteering industry or sector was almost completely shut down. It stopped happening during COVID-19. Now, the lack of funding to a lot of these institutions that normally came from the volunteers had a really serious impact on a lot of these orphanages, and some of them closed down. Many of them sent the children back to their families rapidly, which was not, in many cases, not done very well. There was no preparation, no social workers to support that. But interestingly, certainly I saw in Kenya, for many of these children, they went back to their families, and actually they were kind of okay with their families, which again raised the question, why were they in the orphanages in the first place? And there's some research that's been done recently which has shown that the orphanages and the children's homes that rely most heavily on donations from volunteers were the ones that struggled most significantly as a result of the volunteering industry shutting down. A bit of good news, because ultimately I'm a positive person. There's been a lot of work in the tourism industry as a result of COVID to say, right, we really need to rethink what we're doing now, guys. We need to build back better. We need to make tourism more ethical. There's a lot of strong voices calling for that. And there's also some evidence, there's been some positive reflection by a number of institutions in countries, people saying, actually, it's making me think, we took the children from their families because we thought we could care for them better, but actually they're doing quite well at home. And actually what we've been doing is we've been sending the money to the families instead, or supporting the children in their families. And it's kind of working quite well. Gosh, maybe the children can stay in their families. We're starting to see some signs of that, some institutions reflecting on what's happened. And my hope is that that really does get taken on board, and many children's homes and orphanages start to see the benefits of family-based care. The current situation we're in, many difficulties of volunteering internationally still. Tourism industry is not really taken off yet, but it's starting to. We are concerned, though, that when it does really take off, what's going to happen? Whilst there's been some good rhetoric from the tourism and volunteering sectors about building back better and being more ethical, they're also desperate to survive. At this, to be quite frank, I feel sorry for them in many ways. It's a very hard time for them, and they may well cut corners just to try and get the money in. So it's something we need to monitor very carefully. Now, I'm often asked the question, is it ever acceptable to volunteer in an orphanage or a children's home? And in most cases, I'd say no, I don't think it is acceptable to volunteer with children in any kind of residential care setting. It's just not acceptable for the reasons I've given. There is one exception, and I want to explain what that is. It's if a volunteer has professional skills. Let's say they're a nurse or a social worker or a psychologist. They've actually got professional skills that meet a local need. There's a need for social work or a need for a psychologist to support a particular institution or orphanage. And if the focus of that volunteer's work is on building the capacity of local staff, so that it's not about going in, doing some work and leaving, it's about helping the local staff to improve their skills so that they can carry that work forward. And if proper safeguarding and oversight mechanisms are in place, and if the institution is going through a process of transitioning to family and community-based care, hasn't got a plan to keep going forever, it wants to transition towards getting the children back to families, then I think this is acceptable. But these are pretty tough conditions, and effectively, we might call this volunteering, but effectively this is pro bono professional support to support the deinstitutionalized process or the care reform process in a country. What are the ethical alternatives? Now, I feel like I've been a bit doom and gloom. I've given you a very negative picture, a very depressing picture of the situation, which I'm afraid is the reality from my perspective. But as I say, I'm pro-volunteering. I want people to volunteer. I know the benefits I got from volunteering in India when I was younger, from volunteering in the UK. I think volunteering is a really good thing. I'm 100% behind volunteering when it's done well. I want to see it done well. I don't want to stop volunteering. So if you are going to volunteer, think about projects which keep families and communities together, that don't involve separating children. So you could be supporting a project that provides livelihoods training to mothers so that they can earn money, which means they're more empowered, so they can keep their children with them and not be forced into letting their children go to an orphanage. It could be disaster preparedness work, so that you're helping a village or a community prepare for an earthquake or for a flood, so that when that happens, the family can stay together and they don't get separated. There are many different ways, hundreds of ways you could help families and communities to stay together so children are not separated. Think about volunteering at home. I mean, as I said earlier, there are, certainly I can speak from the perspective of the UK, we have got so many problems in the UK, you know, and I increasingly think, why would I run over to the other side of the world to help to try and solve someone else's problem when there's very skilled and talented people there who are far better placed to do that than me, when actually there are many serious problems in my own society, and you don't have these kind of power differential issues in your own society. You speak the language, you know the culture, there's a lot you can do. Skills matching is an obvious one. Think about the skills you've got. If you're a website designer, are you best placed to go and support an orphanage to work with children who have been traumatized or trafficked? Or would you be in a good place to go and help a children's organization working to keep children and families together with their website? There are lots of NGOs around the world that would probably love you to go over and help them build a website for free. Think about volunteering for children, not with children. There are so many risks of volunteering directly with children, even beyond the orphanage space, that there's lots of backroom support you can do: fundraising, report writing, designing someone's website. At Next Generation Nepal, where I worked in Nepal, we would take volunteers sometimes to do backroom support. We had a wonderful British volunteer that came over, and they trained all our staff and some of the care leavers in using Microsoft packages. And they had a great time. For 2 weeks, they hung out with all the staff, they went for lunch with them every day, made some great friends, and they did some really good work that really helped our organization. They didn't have any contact with the children, which was appropriate. Learning service, have a look into this. There's a great book called Learning Service, a guide to it. I think it's called A Guide to Responsible Volunteering, written by someone I know well called Claire Bennett and Daniela Papi. And they take this American idea of service learning, which is what they call volunteering in America, and they switch it around to learning service. That rather than going out saying, I'm going to serve you, I'm going to help you, and I'll learn about myself in the process, you switch that around and you say, actually, It's not, I'm going to go out and I'm going to learn from you. I'm going to learn about your culture. I'm going to learn about the context you're in and the problems you're facing and what you're doing to solve them. And in that process, if I can help, I will. But it switches it round. So it takes away that power differential of the white savior going over to help the local people, to saying that the white person goes over, if you like, to learn from local people, to recognize that there's a lot they can learn. I saw a lot of that actually in Peter and Sarah's presentation, talking about how much they felt they were learning from Kenyans, which I thought was great. Responsible tourism, missions trips, development, education. There's lots you can do where you just go over to a country. You're just a responsible tourist. You donate to local, you support local organizations, you talk to local people, you go over to learn, you do development, education, study trips to learn about local things. Last day talked a lot about that, like study trips and so on. I think that's great, where you just go to learn about a local culture. And community-based tourism, where you can stay with a host family, you can live in a community, you can learn about the community without going over there to solve all their problems. Final word of warning, then I'll stop. I just want to say that if you are supporting volunteers in orphanages at the moment, and you've heard this talk, if this isn't a message to say you need to pull out immediately. That could be very dangerous. Transitioning away from orphanage volunteerism is a gradual and sensitive process which requires careful consideration and planning. So a bit like deinstitutionalization, it's not something you just withdraw from, it's something that needs thinking about. So it's a gradual process, so it doesn't affect the institution, it doesn't collapse, the children aren't harmed, you don't undermine your volunteers' sense of confidence of what they've done. It needs to be communicated very carefully. I'll stop there. I'm sure there's lots we can talk about later. Thanks very much.
A great pleasure introducing our next and final speaker. This is Rebecca Knepp, and I think Rebecca and I first met each other at a conference on the UN Guidelines on Alternative Care of Children in Geneva, what, about 4 or 5 years ago? Yeah, time flies when you're having fun. And Rebecca is speaking to us today from Cambodia. And Rebecca is the senior technical advisor for the Better Care Network. And for those of you who don't know the Better Care Network, I really, really do recommend you look up their website. It's probably one of the best repositories of documents, research, resources, and discussion on children and the issue of alternative care that there is anywhere globally that we can all access. And they have a whole library of reports going back, I think, about 10 years, if not more, from countries all around the world, written by NGOs, as well as the UN, as well as academics and researchers and people such as like Rebecca and Martin. So I really do urge you to look at the Better Care Network website, because it really has a lot of helpful information there, particularly if you're wanting to know more about a particular topic of alternative care. And they definitely have a whole library of resources on this topic that we're talking about today, which is volunteerism. Rebecca has 21 years experience working in international development and child protection, and has particularly focused on care reforms, family strengthening, and community-led development. She's the co-chair and co-founder of Rethink Orphanages Network, which again, I know she'll talk about today, but it's again a website I would really urge you to look at, because they've done an awful lot of important work on this issue. And it's a cross-sector network that aims to prevent the unnecessary institutionalization of children by shifting the way, and this is for Australia particularly, engages with overseas aid and development. Along with several colleagues from Rethink Orphanages, Rebecca's been leading the work to look at regulatory and legislative measures introduced in Australia to combat orphanage trafficking, orphanage tourism, and to prevent the charity sector and foreign aid funds from contributing towards the unnecessary institutionalization of children. And I think what we heard, particularly from Martin and from Sinet, is that we know that the continuation of money going into orphanages and institutionalizations mean they continue to exist. And there's a lot of work around the world, and I think Martin mentioned this, to shift the funding over a process, a careful process, as Martin already said, from putting money into institutions so that people such as Sinet could actually have remained in a family setting rather than the money going into the pockets of directors of institutions. And I'm not saying all money goes into all directors' pockets, but we do know there are people who've set these institutions up for the sake of earning money. Rebecca is also a co-convener of ACFID, which is a Child Rights Community of Practice, and she represents ACFID on the National Roundtable on the Human, as a member of the, on the National Roundtable on Human Trafficking and Slavery. And again, those words are very important that we're hearing today in connection with children who are placed in large residential institutions. And indeed, I'm afraid to say, a concern now that this is also happening out of family-based care. So I think this is, something else we've got to be very aware of. We're talking about residential care today, but I'm personally aware of children who are being trafficked out of foster care. So I think we've got to think about that in a broader sense. She's also a member of the Australian Institute of Criminology's Expert Advisory Group for the monitoring of Australian Government National Action Plan to combat modern slavery. Rebecca, with all of those wonderful experience and attributes, we're really looking forward to hearing from you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, and thank you for having me today. It's been wonderful hearing the speakers that have gone before me, and they've been, incredibly rich and informative presentations. So thank you to all of the presenters that have shared today of their experience. I'm going to just share my screen, if that's okay, and bring up the slides. Oh, there we go. Excellent. So in this session, Martin has already, looked at some of the issues and the harms associated with orphanage volunteering and tourism. And as Martin said, myself included, we recognise that volunteering has great benefits for organisations, can bring great benefits to volunteers themselves, can bring great benefits to communities. And so the issue is not about discouraging volunteering or even necessarily volunteerism, but it's really about looking at the ethics of this practice, the power dynamics, as Martin has already mentioned, and looking at the aspects of this practice that are harmful and need to be avoided, which of course today's focus is on volunteering in orphanages or other residential facilities. So we've talked about the harms already and why there is a global move away from this practice. All of the evidence, what we know, the experience that Sinead has shared with us, which mirrors the experience of thousands of young people and children who have been subjected to orphanage tourism and orphanage volunteering. And we've heard, very powerful testimony today of how that affects children. So in this session, I'm not going to be repeating those issues, but I really want to focus on looking at the progress that has been made in reaching the tipping point towards really starting to see this practice changed and eradicated, and a little bit of a look at some of the initiatives that have been happening across the different sectors that have been involved in orphanage volunteering and orphanage tourism to raise awareness, to support organisations to undergo an ethical process of divesting or transitioning their practices. Also, how it is being perceived by different communities, how it is being perceived by governments, what commitments have been made at the international level, because all of these things shape the environment that we are all working within. And so it's really important for those of us who are involved in international development, child protection work, volunteer sending or facilitating, to understand what is taking place in this operating environment, what is changing, not only what has already been put in place, but what's coming down the pipeline in terms of the implementation of various commitments. Secondly, in this session, I want to highlight some of the resources that have been developed, and we're going to focus on resources that have been developed through interagency efforts. There are more resources than we can possibly cover today, but as Chrissy already said, they are all housed on the Better Care Network resource library online, and we have a dedicated section there towards this issue where you can find all of the different resources and guides and tools that have been developed by many, many organizations to support you in unpacking this further, or in divesting or transitioning, or working with partners throughout those processes. So we'll have a look at a few of those. So I want to start by just having a look at some of the early campaigns that have come out around this particular issue and where some of the interagency efforts really began. So one of the earliest initiatives was one that was co-launched by Better Care Network along with Save the Children UK. And it was called, and originally, Better Volunteering, Better Care. And this was a global working group that was formed that had over 100 different agencies from across various sectors, including child protection, education, travel sector, faith sector, and included a number of academics as well. And the network was originally formed because child protection actors in particular, including many who worked in countries where this issue was prevalent, were not only seeing the negative impacts on children that both Martin and Sinette have very articulately described today, but they were also seeing how the volunteering in residential care issue was also undermining governments' ability to actually reform their care sector. So many governments have made a commitment to reduce the use of institutional care. Many have made a commitment to fully replace it, but their ability to implement and outwork those commitments was being undermined by the constant stream of resources and attention being directed towards these residential care centres through the volunteering, inroad into that particular issue. And so with this understanding and seeing these issues happening, this network was formed to really address this issue of orphanage volunteering and also orphanage tourism. So it was that dual concern about the system's impact and the impact on children. And there was a number of early initiatives that were launched by the network, including a month-long coordinated blogging blitz that were really just about trying to get the issue on the radar. It wasn't something that was being talked about extensively at the time. And so the first step was actually trying to give the issue some visibility. This initiative also resulted in the development of a number of sector-specific guidelines, resources, and campaigns. We know that the Christian faith-based sector in particular, not at the exclusion of other faiths, but we understand that Christian faith communities have had long-term significant investments in supporting vulnerable children, and this has often been directed towards children in orphanages. And so one of the early campaigns that was a partnership between Better Volunteering, Better Care and ACC International, a faith-based NGO in Australia, was about looking at this issue in the context of short-term missions. And ACCI had already gone through their own process of moving away from supporting residential care and moving away from short-term missions in orphanages overseas to then developing a resource and engaging with the faith community in Australia and beyond to bring that awareness and support around how to make that transition within that community. There was also another organization in the US that did a similar thing called Faith to Action. And Faith to Action is really looking at this issue with the evangelical community in the US. And so they developed a number of resources and guides and case studies to help bring this issue to the attention of faith-based actors in the US and guide them again through that process of change and ethical short-term missions. In the travel and tourism space, there was a whole lot of outreach happening with travel companies, with volunteerism companies, with volunteer sending companies to try to encourage them to divest. And there was a handful of quite high profile companies that did divest, and they were quite public about their divestment. And many of them came on board to support advocacy efforts moving forward. There were some that didn't divest and that were very public in support of ongoing practices, but even some of those have divested over time. There was a number of advocates. This is the organisation that Martin used to work for and was leading some of this important work, who were also part of Better Care, Better Volunteering, Better Care, who were based in those countries like Nepal, like Cambodia, like Uganda, where this issue was quite prevalent, where they were hotspot countries. And they were implementing a range of really innovative initiatives in country to try to raise awareness with volunteers and with tourists who, as Martin said, may not have gone to that country with the intention of volunteering in an orphanage, but come across the notices, come across the advertising inviting them to do so. And so these events that Next Generation held, called Wisdom Wednesdays, they were also held in Cambodia, were about engaging with the tourists whilst in country to try to get them to understand what these issues were and to look at more ethical practice. Now, we saw in 2016, we saw a big jump in the public awareness and I guess the traction publicly around this issue when J.K. Rowling got on board through her organisation Lumos and independently as a public figure and began really tweeting about the issue. That raised a lot of visibility, which included a lot of backlash. And so at that time, we saw a lot of organisations, particularly companies, who were facilitating orphanage tourism and volunteering, really kick back quite hard, quite publicly, to try to defend their practice in response to seeing some of these social media posts coming out. Again, that resulted in some of them divesting, not always out of recognition that the practice was harmful. Some of them were divesting because of the change in public sentiment, or because of the media attention that was increasingly coming on the issue. Now, in 2016, we also saw the formation of the first country hub, which was Rethink Orphanages in Australia. And as Chrissy mentioned before, was one that I was involved in founding. And we were, as a network, able to engage with the Australian government. And it was the same cross-sectoral network, but we were able to work with different sectors, but primarily with government, to start to see changes to legislation and regulation in Australia around this particular issue, including how our charities were engaging overseas, how our companies in Australia were engaging overseas, and putting this into the context of issues such as supply chain issues and looking at it through that language and through legislation designed to address slavery and slavery-like practices in supply chain issues. And that resulted in a number of really positive steps forward, and the Australian government taking quite a strong leadership role, with other countries encouraging similar action. And so we saw other countries also setting up country hubs, and the whole Better Volunteering network was rebranded Rethink Orphanages at that time. So in the US, in the UK, and in the EU, members were also advocating with their governments. And we saw quite a number of these governments that were key volunteer and funding sending countries starting to put out guidance to their citizens in their travel advice, and in other ways about the harms associated with volunteering or volunteerism in residential care centres whilst overseas. So here you can see one from the UK government. The US government put something out similar, as have many other governments as well. We also saw a number of big companies like Flight Centre and Projects Abroad and Intrepid and World Challenge divesting at that point and forming networks to engage with other travel companies to help them go through the same journey. There was a number of big campaigns that came out. One of those campaigns was one called by Rethink Orphanages Network called The Love You Give. And this was a youth-led and youth-targeted social media campaign and behaviour change campaign that was really about bringing the voices of young people who, like Sinette, had been the focus of volunteers' efforts, who then shared about how it made them feel, how it affected them, and what they were actually asking young volunteers and tourists to consider in looking at ethical practice. And so this resulted in a documentary story being put out, a number of other resources to support young people to go through a behaviour change process, from understanding the issue to changing their own practices, to becoming advocates within their own communities and their own networks, to see more and more people come to understand the harms associated with orphanage tourism. And so there's a short film that you can go onto the Rethink Orphanages website and have a look at it. And it's very, very powerful, very articulately spoken by a number of young people in Kenya in particular. Lumos also released a campaign called Helping Not Helping, and this was another high-profile campaign to really help people understand how the best of their intentions may not actually translate into the best of impacts for children. And it also included a university's pledge to reach out specifically to the university sector, knowing that many universities were either advertising placements or facilitating placements, including for credits through their courses. And so that was a specific targeted campaign to engage universities in the discussion as well. Now, this was one of the most provocative campaigns that you may have come across already. That was released by Friends International and supported by UNICEF. It was a part of their Child Safe Network campaign, which is all about child safety, both in community and in context of tourism, and included this very provocative image about children are not tourist attractions. And so it was really circulated quite widely in Cambodia and in Thailand, but got a fair bit of attention internationally as well. Friends International went on to develop a set of guidelines with G Adventures and the Planetaria Foundation around child welfare in the travel industry and good practice guidelines. And so they're really, really rigorous guidelines that organisations promoting community-based tourism, particularly homestays and community stays, can work through to make sure that their practices are ethical and child safe. We also saw a number of excellent good practice codes and guidelines coming out of volunteer sending agencies, volunteering for development agencies, many in combination or partnership with travel partners. And these include the Koloff Good Practice Guideline, Code of Good Practice, which was one of the forerunners in developing guidance for volunteer sending organisations in development. We also saw the Forum release their global standards for volunteering for development, and they've just recently launched an online assessment tool to support that, which is a really, really good tool and quite an industry standard tool for volunteering for development organisations. We also saw ECPAT really help to bring this issue into the context of child sexual exploitation in travel and tourism. As Martin said, we know that most people who volunteer have the best of intentions, but there are some who use that open door with an intention to really access children who are very vulnerable in order to perpetrate abuse. And so ECPAT developed the code, which was another kind of good practice standards, a membership-based program for travel companies to make sure that their travel and tourism practices are safe for children and are not facilitating the sexual exploitation of children whilst engaging in travel and tourism. And they integrated the issue of orphanage tourism and volunteering into the code standards and into all of their awareness raising material that supports those standards. Now, a number of the organisations and travel and tourism and volunteer sending organisations that had already gone through that process of transitioning their practices, making all of their own internal changes to their policies, to their partnerships, then formed together a task force, a divestment task force that was also chaired by the head of the UN's responsible business unit, and looked at developing this set of resources really for organisations who are undergoing a divestment process. And so this includes case studies from travel and tourism and volunteer sending organisations who have divested, It includes some of their lessons learnt. It includes guidelines for how to do that. As Martin said, we're not asking organizations, whether you're for-profit or non-profit, to immediately terminate those practices, because that can cause further harm and detriment, but to go through a really well thought through and very ethical process of divesting and transitioning. And so this really helps to step that out, particularly for volunteer sending organizations or tourism companies. Again, that's available online on the Rethink Orphanages website, or you can also find it on the Better Volunteering website. There was curriculum developed for the school sector, for high schools, and this was done in Australia and in the UK, but you can access this. It is open source. And these are education modules that are designed to be integrated into these public curriculum that can be accessed by teachers when they are doing global studies classes or other classes that have a similar kind of theme, where they can bring this issue in to really educate students about the issues of orphanage tourism and volunteering. And so these were trialled in a number of public schools in Australia, and I believe also in the UK. And that was a partnership between World Challenge, who again were one of the largest school trip sending organizations, who used to send lots and lots of trips every year to a wide range of orphanages in different countries around the world, but have since fully divested of that practice and are now part of efforts to raise awareness and to bring change within the education sector. Now, obviously, these seminars have all been framed around the key recommendations of the UN General Assembly Resolution on the Rights of the Child, and unpacking different aspects of that commitment that was made at the end of 2019 by states in the UN system. And in the lead up to that event, there was a massive effort, mainly led by the child protection community, but also involving a range of other organizations. And a coalition was formed of over 250 organizations spanning the grassroots right up to the global level. And together, the coalition developed what we call the key recommendations, which was suggested focal areas, themes, and suggested language for states to consider in the development and the writing of the text of the resolution. And so the issue of volunteering in orphanages was raised in these key recommendations. It was raised in the Secretary General's report coming out of the UN prior to the event, and it was then taken into the drafting of the text itself. And so this was the process that led to the formation of that resolution, which gave us, for the very, very first time, language within the international community, within that system of international norms and building international norms about the issue of orphanage volunteering, the harms associated with it, and the links, as Martin has already shared, between that and orphanage trafficking, which is that type of child trafficking where children are brought into residential care facilities when it's not in their best interest, but for the purpose of some form of exploitation, most commonly to do with profiting. But as Sanette has shared in her own experience, those exploitation forms can also include labor and sexual exploitation as well. And so we saw through that states making that commitment to actually understanding these harms and to taking steps to address these harms and measures to really look at curtailing orphanage volunteering and the exploitation of children in residential care settings as a part of the commitment to that particular resolution. And we've seen that text already today. Now, following on from the resolution in 2019, we very, very recently had a day of general discussion, which some of you may have been involved in. And the day of general discussion is run by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, who, as you know, is the monitoring body for the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the implementation of those articles in different states who are party to it. And this was a follow-on from the from the resolution in 2019 to pick up that same theme about children who are outside of parental care or at risk of being separated from their families, and really to have a discussion about what do we need to be prioritizing? What are the focus areas? How do we take the language that was adopted unanimously by states in the resolution and actually look at how we begin to implement it in order to see those rights actualized for all children? And this was a process where lots and lots of civil society organizations, children, young people, human rights bodies, governments, independent advocates made submissions to the committee to raise their voice about what they see as some of the most important things that needed to be included in the discussion. There were a number of submissions that raised the issue of orphanage volunteering and tourism and the harms and the connection to how governments can sometimes struggle to reform their care systems when there's still this channel of support coming into the countries, bypassing the government via private funding and via volunteering. And so it was picked up in the submissions and it was integrated in a number of the sessions of the day of general discussion. Sinette was one of the speakers at that particular event who again brought a very compelling testimony to the committee around that particular issue. And we also had a senator from Australia who talked about the measures that have taken place in Australia to combat orphanage volunteering and also the nexus between it and trafficking. So in the final session of the day of general discussion, the committee members reiterated the importance of addressing this issue and really looking at measures that states can adopt and implement to reduce orphanage volunteering, to curtail it, and also to address those issues with trafficking. And one of the submission that as Rethink Orphanages that we made that was actually picked up by the committee in the language that was discussed in that final section that I just want to talk to you briefly about now is what we call extraterritorial obligations of states. And the reason why I want to bring this to your attention is in terms of looking towards how states might begin, how countries might begin to look at this in terms of how do they take the commitment they made in the UN resolution, how do they take that commitment and implement it under their responsibilities as party to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this is one of the frameworks that states that is beginning to be looked at and was raised by the committee in the day of general discussion to begin to encourage states to really approach this from the perspective of their obligations under international law towards children's rights. And so states have, under the CRC, they have some obligations that extend beyond their own borders, and these are extraterritorial obligations of states. And we know that the framework of human rights is built upon three obligations: the obligation to respect, which means not to do anything that encroaches on someone else's right; to protect, which for a government means to prevent companies or their own citizens from doing something that encroaches upon the right of a child; and the right to fulfill, which is the positive right to take steps to actually put in place programs or funding or whatever it might be to fulfill those rights. But these two obligations, to respect and protect, are relevant for governments who are the sending governments. So we're now talking about governments like Australia or the UK or Denmark, who is a country that sends volunteers or sends funding to other countries to support residential care institutions, and whether that is just funding or also volunteering. So this framework of extraterritorial obligations is about asking states to consider not only what their moral obligations are, understanding what is and what isn't in the best interest of children, but it's also asking them to consider what their obligations are as state party to an international convention, to respect the rights of children, meaning that in their own government programs, this is about government's own funding, their foreign aid funding, their overseas development aid, their own state sanctioned or state supported volunteering sending practices, to make sure that those things are not encroaching on the rights of children, by supporting institutionalization that isn't necessary, or by putting children at risk of harm through practices such as orphanage volunteering. It's also asking them to consider their obligation to protect, which means looking at regulation of their own charity sector and their own commercial entities that are registered in their own countries, and how the activities of those charities or the activities of those companies overseas encroach upon the rights of children. And so this is the framework under which states may begin to consider their obligations to regulate funding, to regulate volunteering practices, and to raise awareness in their own countries to try to prevent their citizens, their domestic charities with overseas activities, or their domestic companies with overseas activities from perpetuating some of these practices that we now know to be not only harmful, but actually can cause the violation of children's rights that are protected under that international law. So it's a very legal argument, but it's an important one to at least have some visibility of, because it may be what starts to encourage states to make those changes that are going to affect, you know, charities in our countries, and the work of volunteer sending organizations or tourism companies as well. So that's a bit of a read of the landscape of what efforts have been underway over this period of time since about 2013, when it really came onto the radar, what's happening within the different sectors, but also what's happening at that international level as a follow-on from the resolution on the rights of the child, around which these workshops have been organised, in terms of what then happened at the day of general discussion and what's now on the table for consideration around putting this issue in the context of state obligations under international law. So we've gone from the grassroots right up to the top, and now I want to come back down to the ground level just to finish this session and think about, what does that mean for us? Whether you are a local organisation, a development agency, a child protection organisation, a volunteer sending organisation, a donor agency, whatever position you take within this issue, whatever vantage point that you have, there are different ways that we can all get behind raising awareness and seeing more ethical practice for children from whatever position we are coming at this issue from. And the first step for all of us is to really learn. As we often say, we can be lifelong learners. There's more to this than we'll ever be able to completely understand. There's more stories to hear, there's more perspectives to hear. But I think it starts with really learning, and all of us adopting a position to say, there's more that I can understand about this issue, and being proactive in that learning journey. So checking out people's websites that have resources, speaking to advocates, engaging with organizations who have already undertaken a transition journey, who can provide you insight on what it means, what it looks like, how to approach it. And then the second thing is to really understand your own organization's position. Where do you sit with this issue, and in response to potentially making changes to practice in order to see ethical engagement with children through volunteering and through volunteerism. So understanding where you're coming from as an organisation, and identifying the areas within your organisation where there's more awareness raising that might need to happen, or there might be some policies that need to be changed in order to really shift practice. Or there might be stakeholders beyond your organisation that need to go on this journey first in order for you to be able to make this change. So understanding the issue, understanding your organization's position, and then beginning that journey of internal advocacy. Find out where there may still be points of resistance, and really taking the time to walk people through the issue, to engage in a positive way and advocate internally to get people on board so that they can all participate in and support that change process. We all know that it's absolutely critical that we don't just talk about what we stop doing, but we talk about what do we do instead. So what are those ethical alternatives? And engaging within your organization and with people outside your organization in what those things could be. It's really important we present alternatives to people who have been, going overseas, organizations that have been sending volunteers. And Martin outlined a number of key considerations for you to think through with respect to developing ethical alternatives. Join the collaborative efforts. We would love to invite you to become part of Rethink Orphanages. There is an EU hub if you would like to join the EU hub. There is a global working group if you would like to join the global working group. We have a global collaborative platform that is set up for the care sector and is something that BCN facilitates, but it's very much member-led. And it is all about bringing people together in order to foster collaboration, because these types of issues are issues that require lots and lots of participation in order to resolve. So join those collaborative efforts and contribute your learning and your experience, but also learn from others. And together we can really start to see this change. And then I would encourage you to share your story. If you've gone through that change process, or you're in the middle of going through that transition or divestment process, share your story with others, because when we hear about the perspectives and the experience of organizations that have gone through it themselves, it is much more powerful than hearing about someone talk about the issue in an abstract way who's not actually had to walk through that journey themselves. And so becoming an advocate by sharing your own story to encourage others, and then engaging in external advocacy. We did a research piece in Australia that showed us that it was done in the faith community in Australia, the Christian faith community, and it showed us that 1 in 2 churches supported an orphanage, and 1 in 2 Christians knew either directly engaged in supporting an overseas orphanage or were involved in a church that did so. Every other person has a connection to an overseas orphanage. So there are so many people in our own networks, in our own communities, in our own spheres that we can influence as we begin to speak about this, who may not have heard about it from anybody else. And so there are lots of opportunities to advocate externally in your own community, but again, also participate in those wider collaborative efforts to really begin to advocate for ethical practice in this area and for strengthening children's rights, whether you're from Denmark and you're working in that kind of sending perspective, or whether you're in one of the countries where residential facilities are and are receiving volunteers and visitors. There are many, many opportunities for us to really begin to advocate together and bring this issue back onto the radar, particularly now that borders are opening, that tourism is restarting, travel is restarting. We know that orphanages are beginning to look at ways to re-engage people in supporting orphanage volunteering and tourism. And so it's a very, very critical moment in time for us to collectively really elevate this issue once again, in order to see, as Martin said, these sectors build back better versus returning to practices that have gone somewhat dormant throughout this period of COVID. So hopefully that gives you both perspective, a bit of visibility of some of the resources you can tap into, but some practical steps about how to get involved in advocacy around this issue too. So I'm going to leave it there and hand it back to you, Chrissy. Thank you.